Despite the nation's intense national focus on Islamic terrorism since 9/11, homegrown right wing extremists have also killed dozens of Americans. The groups include white supremacist and neo Nazi groups and anti federalist militias. Since 2001, the number of violent attacks on U.S. soil inspired by far right ideology has spiked to an average of more than 300 a year, according to a study by the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. A 2015 survey of U.S. law enforcement groups found they consider anti government violent extremists to be a more severe threat than radicalized Muslims. And while jihadist terrorists have killed 95 people in the U.S. since 9/11, far right extremists have killed 68 during the same time, including the car attack in Charlottesville. That's according to data collected by our next guest, Peter Bergen, the director of the National Security Studies Program for New America and a terrorism analyst for CNN. Peter, I know you focus a lot on jihadists, Islamic terror happening in the United States and happening overseas, but you've also been studying and looking closely at kind of homegrown terror and domestic terror threats. When you saw what happened yesterday, what went through your mind?
Well, clearly it was an act of domestic terrorism, and it seems to be an act of extreme right-wing terrorism, and it's one of multiple incidents that we've seen in this country, unfortunately. And in fact, also we're seeing an interesting spike in black nationalist terrorism. There have been 8 deaths since 2016 caused by black nationalists, and we also, you may recall, of course, the attack on the Republican baseball game by a sort of extremist anti-Trump person. So we're seeing, political violence comes in lots of shapes and forms. And I think when we hear the word terrorism, a lot of Americans tend to think jihadi terrorism obviously because of the 9/11 attacks. But the fact is that, we've continued to see extreme right-wing terrorism, and we've seen a slight uptick in kind of leftist terrorism in the last couple of years.
What are the different causes?
Oh, well, they scan the political spectrum, because you have, black nationalist terrorism, which has been spiking. You have a certain amount of anti-Trump terrorism, which has sort of had an uptick. You've had this extreme right, neo-Nazi, anti-government terrorism, which has been pretty constant. After all, it was the most lethal attack on American soil before 9/11 was the Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people, carried out by 2 extreme right-wing militants. So, this has been around for a while. This kind of strain of terrorism that we saw in Charlottesville is not new. They don't tend to kill large numbers like Islamist terrorist attacks, which tend to have a much higher death toll. But it is kind of a constant that's out there.
When you saw the method of destruction yesterday, the car attack, something we've basically been seeing repeatedly overseas in the past year.
Yeah. This has usually been the purview of kind of jihadi terrorist attacks. We've seen 2 in London in recent months that killed 13 people. We saw the attack in Nice that killed 84 people. We saw the attack in Berlin that killed 12 people. All of those were jihadi terrorist attacks. Now we're seeing this tactic being adopted by people with other ideologies. For instance, in Charlottesville, we saw this. And we also saw an attack like this in London outside a mosque relatively recently, in which one person was killed. So unfortunately, using vehicles as a deadly weapon is a tactic that is kind of being adopted by violent terrorists of all ideological stripes.
How much does the labeling of it matter? Calling it terrorism, calling it domestic terrorism, from the media on to the politicians?
I think it's important to call things what they are. And one of the reasons that these domestic terrorist incidents don't get called terrorism often is because there isn't a link to an international terrorist organization. So as a formal matter, if you're charging terrorism as a crime, if there's some link to ISIS or Al-Qaeda, it's very easy to charge as terrorism. Because of First Amendment issues in this country, it's not illegal in this country to be a neo-Nazi. It is illegal to be a neo-Nazi who carries out a violent attack. But when a neo-Nazi carries out a violent attack, it's usually simply treated as murder, or sometimes as a hate crime, but not usually as terrorism from a legal point of view, because there isn't an association with an international terrorist organization such as ISIS, such as Al-Qaeda.
Peter Bergen of New America and an analyst for CNN. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.